My impression was that after the election, there was a period where there was a degree of reflection and a kind of a critical rethink of how the BBC, the other broadcasters, and the press had dealt with Corbynism and the kind of political movements with which it's aligned, the way in which the coverage had understood politics. And partly that was because they all had started egg on their face, because a lot of polling pointed to different outcomes. People massively underestimated the left of the Labour Party, and really it looked like at that stage that the political journalists, the people who we looked to for expertise on politics, didn't understand what was going on. So that was obviously quite embarrassing for everybody involved. And I think, from my recollection, there was a period where there was some sort of critical reflection and discussion as to what went wrong and how we might do things differently. But that seemed to die down relatively quickly, I think. After a few weeks, it was sort of back to business as usual. Similarly to what happened with the referendum, you know, there was a sort of sense that we got things wrong, but then justifications start to emerge. People stop talking about it, and yeah, back to business as usual. And then now, I think it was interesting time, you know, to think about, are these institutions going to change? Are new voices going to get access? Are the editorial processes going to be revised? It's not completely clear whether there's been a process of change, but there's very little that I've seen to suggest that there's been any radical or substantive rethink. Now we've reached a point where, yeah, there's certain attacks on independent media, which are coming from sort of key figures within the BBC and The Guardian. And really, I think the whole of the establishment media now seems to be talking with one voice. Now, in terms of the basis of Nick Robinson's critique, first of all, there definitely seems to be a sort of a pack mentality at work, where most establishment journalists are all agreeing that the independent media is a major problem, that it's undermining the capacity to do good journalism. Now, in terms of the arguments that are being made, if you look at these establishment journalists, there's a problem with journalism, and that's the starting point. But it's never a discussion that begins with the major journalistic institutions in this country. It tends to start with a couple of things. So Nick Robinson says there's an issue with political polarisation. That was one element of his argument. And then he said there's a problem with the alternative media. Now, the political polarisation, I mean, that much I think is true. The problem with it, though, is it doesn't acknowledge why there's political polarisation, right? What's going on in society? Why are people disaffected with the establishment? Why is that attracting people towards different alternatives? And what? First of all, there's a question of what's driving that process. And I think you can make a good argument that institutions like the estate of the press and the broadcasters and the politics of those institutions has been part and parcel of a kind of discontent with the way that society is and the direction it's going in. Now, secondly, the independent media and the argument that that's what's driving a kind of disaffection with the establishment organisations, and this represents all kinds of problems for journalism. Again, it's putting the horse before the cart, because if you start from the point that, okay, the reason people don't believe the newspapers or the broadcasters anymore is because people are putting about the idea that they're untrustworthy, I mean, it just completely avoids the question of why people think that's convincing, right? Because the reason why people accept these accounts of these institutions is because it rings true to them, because they feel like they're not doing what is expected of them, that they're not giving a fair and balanced account of what's going on in the world, or they're not speaking to the conditions that people find themselves in. The evidence is on their side. You know, there's a huge amount of scholarly evidence on how the mainstream media, as it tends to get called, reports. Now, the press, I don't think anyone doubts that the majority of the press is propagandistic and politically partisan. The BBC, there's a huge amount of literature on how the BBC reports. It tends to reflect powerful interests in society. It tends to reflect a very narrow sector of political opinion, and it tends to defer to state institutions and official politics and how it construes issues. Now, that at least should be the starting point for any sensible discussion as to what we need to do about journalism and how we need to reform these institutions. It's one of the ironies of this line that Nick Robinson's pushing, that a lot of the things that he accuses the alternative media for, or the independent media, are just things which the private press has been, leading the charge on for decades. Like fake news, there's a lot of anxiety about fake news at the moment. Like newspapers like The Sun or the Daily Mail, like that's what they do. They do fake news. That's more or less their business model. They're committed to it, and they're quite explicit about it. Now, that's what I think just kind of laughable about the debate in terms of, attacking the Canaries' news values. I think we could have a sensible, critical conversation about how independent media should report things, about journalistic practices, about the sort of funding models which we create, and what kind of information and knowledge, if you like, that's producing. But to see the Canary as somehow an outlier in the world of the British media just seems to me to be absurd. If the problem is inaccurate reporting or or fake news, as that particular article was called, then they would be talking about the private press, which is owned by billionaires. It very explicitly reflects those interests. And Nick Robinson didn't even mention the Sky bid in that article, and that should be the starting point, right? But I think it would sort of seem rude for Nick Robinson to mention that. There's this kind of strange kind of professional solidarity that seems to exist between the BBC and the private press. And it's bizarre in a way, because also these have been the key institutions which have been waging a guerrilla war against the BBC. They've been doing that relentlessly since really, the 1980s. And that's been ongoing, and everybody knows it. I interviewed a very good journalist, Sarah O'Connell, for a podcast I co-present with Dan Hind called Media Democracy. And we spoke to her about the ways in which journalists are perceived particularly by low-income groups, met with an enormous amount of hostility, which I think really took people back. She mentioned that she had a colleague who attended the Occupy protests from the BBC, and they expected to be welcomed when they arrived, to be able to go there and talk, with ease of people about their concerns about, banking, lack of democracy, and all those kinds of issues which were being discussed. And actually, they were met with this enormous hostility from the Occupy movement. And I think that took them back. And we saw a real intensification of that recently. If you see how people in Grenfell responded to the media as not being people who would now tell their stories, but people who hadn't shown any interest in their lives and saw them as part of the establishment correctly. Now, there are different elements to that. I think the fact that the BBC sees politics as going on in particular locations and basically directs its journalism and the routine working practices towards those institutions is part of it. So the fact that it does exist, political journalism exists in the Westminster bubble, it's not particularly interested in local politics. It's not interested in many of the issues which are really the most central concerns for people, particularly if you're in a low-income area, or if you're finding difficulties with like welfare recipients, or you're on the sort of hard end of austerity. Those are not people who the BBC has shown an interest in. So part of that is because the BBC is just orientated towards official politics, and part of it is about the sort of people who are recruited to the BBC, the sort of classes that they come from, the sort of social circles that they move in. So the BBC has very elitist recruitment practices. They tend to draw people heavily from Oxbridge, and they tend to come from private schools, or at least the representation of people from private schools is hugely disproportionate. And the sorts of people who are their friends with and they spend their time with are just very far removed socially, if not geographically, from the kind of world that those people live in. And reporting has just not shown any interest in what's going on at the bottom of society, as it were. It's tend to focus on the action at the top, and not, I should add, in a very critical way. I think it's perfectly legitimate for us for journalists and for sociologists to be examining people at the top of society, but of course you need to do that critically, and you can never really lose sight of what the consequences of actions taken at the top are for people at the bottom, because that should be part of the story. You know, if the government is pushing for an austerity agenda, people need to know what the human consequences of that is. And I think the media generally has done a very poor job of that. And I think, like anything, if something will start to not ring true to you, if you know what's going on in your community, if you know what's going on with like members of your family or your friends, and then you see things on the BBC or in the newspapers or the other broadcasters, which is misrepresenting that, you know that's not the story. That's what breeds mistrust, disaffection, right? It's not that bad ideas about the media have been put about. It's that a whole swathe of society either don't see their voices represented, or insofar as they do appear, because the BBC does cover this stuff, they feel like it's being done in a way that's misrepresenting what's going on. It's not giving a fair portrayal. So I think that's what lies behind the hostility, and it's rooted in all kinds of routine journalistic practices. It's rooted in the sorts of people who work at the BBC, and it's rooted in the BBC's relationship to the state and other institutions.